Okay, welcome to this event by the Center for Philosophical Studies of History. My name is Georg Gangi and I will be today's moderator. Today's speaker is Veli Virmajoki with the topic Philosophy as the Mapping of Conceptual Space, the Case of Causal Explanation in History. Veli is a philosopher of science and a philosopher of historiography at the Finland Futures Research Center of the University of Turku in Finland. His main research interests lie in the futures of science and in counterfactual thinking and historiography, and I think in counterfactual accounts of causality more generally. And I also think one of Veli's research interests is metaphilosophy, but it is my phrasing and not his, and he can correct me, of course, immediately once it's his turn to speak on that. Because I read on his self-description on his homepage that he's very much interested in how philosophical problems are to be approached. And if I understand his abstract and title of today's event correctly, then today's talk is about how the philosophical problem of causation in history is to be approached. Veli has published widely on both of his main research interests, the potential futures of science and counterfactuals in historiography and beyond. His most recently published texts in English are In Defense of Causal Presentism, which was published last year in the journal Hoppos, which probably most of you know, and Understanding Futures of Science, Connecting Causal Layered Analysis and the Philosophy of Science in the Journal of Future Studies, also from last year. And if I can shortly make a claim on the future, I know of another paper of Veli's that will soon come out. And this paper is called Frameworks in Historiography, Explanations, Scenarios, and Futures. And this paper will be published in the second issue of this year of the Journal of the Philosophy of History, which will hopefully come out around June. And I know about this paper because Ilkka Lehtomäki and myself are the editors of that special issue of the journal. And the topic of the special issue will be the future of the philosophy of history. And this special issue is based on a workshop that we had last year in June in Oulu with the same topic. And in the special issue, there will be, next to Veli's great paper, there will be 6 other papers on the topic of the future of the philosophy of history, also by younger scholars. So I can all recommend you, once it is out, to definitely check it out in June. Now, this is the second installment or session of our spring research seminar. After today, in about a month's time, on April 26th, Veli Lehtomäki from the University of Oulu and from our Center for Philosophical Studies of History will be speaking about history of philosophy in practice, some thoughts on historicism and realism. And finally, in May, our research seminar will continue on May 9th. And there we will have the talk Sami Histories, Truth and Reconciliation by Veli-Pekka Lehtola, who is also from the University of Oulu. This latter event will not just take place online, it will also be in a real lecture hall, and it will be together with the Eudaimonia Research Institute of the University of Oulu, but there will also be a live stream, so you can also follow from afar. For more information on all our events, please check out our homepage or our social media accounts. We have Facebook and Twitter. While you're already on our social media, please also consider following us. We don't just try to publish information there about our events, we also try to sort of publish regularly content on the philosophy of history that is of some interest to hopefully more people. Now, I will shut up very soon, just the very anxious technicalities. Please mute yourself during Veli's talk to avoid any unnecessary disturbance. Then after the talk, there will be a discussion session. So when you have any question, concern, comments, criticism, please indicate so first in the chat. I will make a speakers list, so I will also moderate the discussion session. When it's your turn, you can either speak up with or without your camera on, or you can write your question in the chat. If you write your question in the chat, then I will be reading it out to Veli. And we will prioritize people who have not spoken yet, so they will move up on the speakers list. Finally, after the official end of this event here, us people from the center and Veli will stay on in a bit more formal session here on Zoom. So if you're interested in talking to us a bit more informally about whatever is on your mind, then please do so as well. You're all very much welcome to do so. That was it from my side. Thank you very much, Veli. The word is yours, please.
Okay, thanks. I will now share my screen. And actually, I have never considered myself as doing metaphilosophy. I have always found metaphilosophy somewhat strange, but now that George mentioned this, I understood that I am doing meta philosophy even today. But let's see. So I will talk about philosophy as the mapping of conceptual space, and I will study the case of causal explanation in history. And today we will proceed in 3 parts. First, I shall explain the basic idea of what I mean by this conceptual, the mapping of conceptual space. Then I will discuss some recent works on causal narratives, and I will separate or distinguish some issues and notions from that or those works that are relevant for our discussion today. And finally, I will compare 2 accounts of causal explanations in history in terms of how well they enable us to map the conceptual space around causal explanation. And these 2 accounts are so-called mechanistic account and the counterfactual account of causal explanation in history or historiography. I try to use history to refer to the past and historiography to the study of history. So I use the word historiography to refer what many people usually call history, the study of the past and the history. But here, let's go to the basic idea. And my suggestion is that we need to clarify the conceptual core of the notion of causal explanation in historiography and connect this conceptual core to the surrounding conceptual space of goals, notions, and patterns of reasoning that we can find in historiography. Before I go into the details, this is something that I have discussed in a paper that has been published in Journal of the Philosophy of History, although this paper is not too explicit about this methodology. And I want to add that there is another more detailed work which is ready and written, but its publication has hit some problems. And I hope you stay tuned if you are interested in this topic, because I try to get it published one way or another. I won't give up. And the starting point is that many philosophical claims in the field, which I mean philosophy of historiography or history, seems to be confused and unclear or opaque and ambiguous. So there are these issues in historiography which we are not able to fully grasp philosophically, and which tend to cause some trouble in the field itself. And what I argue is that the notions that philosophers formulate need to be powerful enough to just test how the confusions, unclarities, and ambiguities might be addressed. So we need to have conceptual tools to remove these confusions and ambiguities and unclarities. And now I want to go to the philosophy of causal explanation in history, because I cannot discuss this mapping of conceptual space in isolation without using an example of how it can be done, because otherwise the discussion will be way too abstract, and I think nobody would get it. And the other reason, of course, is that I have used this approach myself in philosophy of causal explanation in historiography. So I now turn to more explicitly to the problem of causal explanation in historiography. And I want to point out that in the philosophy of historiography, the accounts of explanations have focused on what kind of connection must hold between some Z, which is a set of events, processes, and conditions, and X, in order for Z to explain X, which is the outcome of these historical processes or events or conditions. And some terminology which is probably familiar to all of you is that the thing to be explained is called explanandum, which is X in our case, and the thing that explains Z and some additional information is called explanans. So explanans is what makes the explaining of the what is explained explanandum. And now when we study explanations and causal explanations in historiography, the point of investigation is to explicate the structure of explanans and its relation to explanandum in historiography. So we need to tell how explanans that are in historiography are connected to the explanandum. And now what I argue is that this that philosophical analysis has two main tasks when it comes to this philosophical clarification. First, it needs to explicate what I call the core notions of causality and or explanation. A philosophical analysis of the notion of causal explanation needs to tell when Z and X have a causal and or explanatory connection. I don't go in this talk to the issue of whether we should define explanation in terms of causality or the other way around. What I mean is that we need to have some core notion of causality or explanation that grounds our analysis. And what these core notions are what are usually analyzed in philosophy when we try to give some definition of what we mean by causality or explanation. This is what is meant by the core notion. So we want to understand these notions themselves. But secondly, and equally, if not more importantly, the philosophical investigation needs to map issues and notions that are tightly connected to causal explanations in historiography, such as explanatory depth, historical contingency, and so on. So we have all these different notions that are somehow related to causal explanations, and we want to understand what is the relationship and how we can clarify these surrounding notions with our core notion. And what I argue is that a philosophical account of historiographical explanation needs to first make these notions understandable and clear, and secondly, be able to connect them to the core of the notion of causality or explanation. So we need to have a core notion which clarifies the surrounding notions, and we also have to tell how these notions, the core notions and surrounding notions, are connected to each other. And here is the crux of the issue. In my view, the function of analyzing the core notions, for example, providing an analysis of the notion of causal explanation, is to provide the basis for further explications and clarifications of issues and notions that are related to causal explanation in historiography. And in my view, the question of how to understand what the notion of causal explanation really means in historiography is fruitless. What we want from these notions is not how they match to some Platonic realm of how notions are really defined, but we want to construct a notion that provides us conceptual clarity in the issues that we want to clarify. And I have this naive analogy which says that seeds only matter if they grow into the kind of tree you wish to eat fruits from. So the core notions and their analysis only matter if they are able to make sense of the issues that we want to make sense of. And this means that a philosophical investigation of historiographical explanation has two directions. On the one hand, it needs to provide an explication or analysis. I prefer the notion of explication of the core notions that can clarify and make understandable the conceptual space surrounding causal explanation in history. So we want to understand, we want to provide a core notion that clarifies and provides understanding of issues surrounding causal explanation. But on the other hand, we also have to map the surrounding conceptual space in order to find those characters of historiographical explanation that the core notions have to be able to capture. So we need to understand what kind of issues are related to causal explanations in historiography in order to know what we require from our core notions. And the argument is that the core notions need to be faithful to the issues and notions that surround causal explanation in historiography. So the core notions need to be such that they make sense of these surrounding issues that we find. And now let's make this a bit more concrete. And we can start from causal narrative. And here we begin by working from the conceptual space toward the conceptual core. And we may take as our starting point insights concerning causal narratives. Adrian Curry has pointed or defined that narrative explanations account for particular events via causal sequences concluding with the explanatory. I would add that causal narrative explanations, because there is another meaning for narrative explanations in historiography that differs from the one given here. So we could say that causal narrative explanations account for particular events via causal sequences concluding with the explanatory. And now the issue is that it is difficult to find an explicit or detailed definition of causality in the characterizations of the notion of causal narrative. So there is this literature on causal narratives where this core notion of causality is very, very rarely defined in itself. However, the lack of an explication of the core notion of causality does not make the philosophical analysis of causal narratives futile. This is due to the fact that there is much more to the philosophy of causal explanation than defining the core notion. And I will point out that the work on causal narratives have improved our understanding of, first, issue of explanatory depth, secondly, on contingency, and thirdly, on generalizations in historiography. There are other issues as well, but these three I will use as an example today. Let's go to the explanatory depth. And here are two examples from the literature. Curry argues that explanatory depth is at least sometimes achieved by moving from simple narratives to disunified complex narratives. And Curry gives a definition of complex narrative. And we don't really need to understand what this really means. We need to just see that there is this analysis given, or this notion of explanatory depth that arises from this discourse on causal narrative. And another example from people who have discussed causal narratives is that Ereshevsky and Turner suggest that a historical explanation gets stronger, in other words, deeper, when the narrative is thickened and tightened. Again, we don't have to understand, but we need to understand that there are these ideas of explanatory depth that stem from analysis of causal narratives. And what this means is that we can see that not all explanations provide equally deep understanding. And the question is, how are the accounts of causal explanation able to explain the issue? We come back to this later. But there is our first issue that we need to clarify: explanatory depth. We need to have an analysis of causality in historiography that makes sense of this issue of explanatory depth that can be found if causal narratives are studied. Another issue is contingency. John Beatty has suggested that narratives are especially good at representing contingency and accounting for contingent outcomes. And it is often related to the idea of narratives as descriptions of turning points. And it is said that a narrative provides understanding about turning points in a sequence of events leading to the outcome. And if we know turning points, we know how things could have been differently. And if we know that, then we can say that it was contingent that this outcome was the case rather than this one. This is the basic idea. And Pertti, following Gold, identifies two senses of contingency. And again, this analysis stems from the analysis of causal narratives. There is the notion of contingency per se, and contingency as causal dependency. An event is contingent per se if it is an unpredictable outcome that could have been absent or could have occurred differently. So it is something that we cannot predict. It is contingent. And another sense of contingency that Pertti formulates is that an event is contingent in the causal dependence sense if its occurrence depended on the occurrence of an earlier event. So we can identify two senses of contingency, at least two senses of contingency, by studying causal narratives. And as the discourse on narrative possibility indicates, there seems to be a connection between contingency and explanation. And this is something we should clarify when we do philosophy of historiography. We need to have core notions that enable us to deal with the issue of contingency. But now we should notice that this connection should not be overplayed. We should not say that explanations must indicate that the outcome was contingent, as some have argued. For example, Sterling has analyzed in detail so-called robust process explanations. They specify both the range of alternative initial conditions across which we would still see a qualitatively similar outcome and the limits on that range. And saying that these kind of robust process explanations are not explanations is implausible. So we should not perhaps build the notion of contingency to the core of the notion of explanation, as some have done. And as said, contingency might not be at the core of historiographical explanation, while still belonging to the conceptual space that an account of explanation needs to clarify. And here we have this kind of methodological rule that we should avoid inflating the conceptual core if we can explain the related issues otherwise. So if we don't have if we can deal with the contingency with our core notion in some way that does not build in the contingency to the core notion, then we are fine. The third issue is generalization. And the question is simply that how can we connect events into a narrative and utilize modal considerations? Modal considerations are considerations about possibilities, and these are something that we need to have if we are discussing turning points in the history. And it seems that we need to have some kind of generalizations that connect the events and make the modal reasoning possible. But of course, there are complications for this intuitive suggestion about generalizations, and it is that the failure of the deductive nomological model made philosophers cautious of suggesting that historiographical explanations involves generalizations in its core. And there are two main strategies to deal with generalization in historiography. The first one is to deny or remain agnostic about generalizations in historiography. For example, Paul Roth has taken this position and argued that since what must be explained has no standardized format that explains it, a temporal sequence that cannot utilize laws or law-like generalizations will be required. So there are no generalizations, according to Paul Roth, that are in the construction of narratives and causal narratives. The second strategy is to suggest that generalizations are needed, but these generalizations are not laws with a large scope. Rather, they are recurrent patterns of causal structure with a much more limited scope of generalizability. So when we analyze causal narratives, we have this feeling that there must be some generalizations that we need. And again, our core notions of causal explanation need to somehow deal with this issue of generalizations. What is the role of generalizations in explaining and how they work? And finally, we also need to notice that it seems that narrative building both requires, as argued above, and support generalizations. And this is due to the simple fact that narratives can speak for or against generalizations. Building a narrative might force us to make certain assumptions in order to make sense of the past that goes against or speak for some generalizations that we hold. I don't go into this in this talk, but this is something that we need to take into account, that our analysis of causal explanation must be such that they can also make understandable how generalizations and narratives are connected in this two-directional way. And now I turn to the core notions and discuss how well they are able to define these issues that we just noticed, which are generalizations, contingency, and explanatory depth. I discussed two accounts of explanation or causal explanation in historiography. One is a mechanistic account and the other is a counterfactual account. And let's go first to the mechanistic account. And in historiography, we can call this account the account of ephemeral mechanisms. Just briefly some background about this mechanisms philosophy. In the philosophy of science, the so-called new mechanical philosophy, or simply new mechanisms, has suggested that revealing mechanisms is crucial for explanations in many areas of science. And this is something that philosophers of science widely agree, that mechanisms are crucial. Not law-like explanations like in perhaps physics and chemistry, but in other sciences like life sciences, these mechanisms are very central. And there is nothing controversial about this basic motivation. And the new mechanism is a philosophy that shifted the emphasis away from universal laws and nomic necessity towards recurrent patterns of causal structure with a much more limited scope of generalizability. And we should notice that the new mechanism has not been equally widely discussed with respect to historiography as it with respect to science. However, Glennon 2010, Swine 2019, and our own George Gango 2021 has suggested that explanations in historiography can be understood in terms of mechanisms. I will discuss about Glennon's account because it is most clearly an attempt to define the very core of the notion of causal explanation in historiography. In general, before we go to these details of this Glennon's account, we can see that in mechanistic account explicitly characterizes mechanisms as robust systems or processes consisting of interacting parts. Mechanisms are systems that produce some phenomenon, behavior, or function. The behavior of mechanisms can be described by mechanistically fragile generalizations. And that mechanism is a system with stable spatial, temporal, and causal structure in which the parts of the mechanism act in regular ways to produce the mechanism's behavior. And now, of course, the question is whether we can understand historical processes or the past in terms of interaction between parts and their activities. And how this trick can be done, because history seems quite different from, let's say, neurons. And in Glennon's analysis, historical explanation proceeds by describing ephemeral mechanisms. And he writes that what seems to distinguish mechanisms in historical sense from mechanistic systems, which are systems characterized here, is that the circumstances that bring together the various entities whose interactions constitute a narrative are ephemeral. So they are like one-hit mechanisms that are only there and nowhere else. That's the basic idea. They are not mechanisms that can be found in many places, like firing of neurons, which happens billions and billions of times each second everywhere. but these are just something that happens once and briefly and due to certain contingencies. And Glennon defines ephemeral mechanisms as follows. Specifically, I think an ephemeral mechanism to be a collection of interacting parts where, first, the interactions between parts can be characterized by direct, invariant, change-relating generalizations. And here we already see that generalizations play some role here, and this account can deal with generalizations. But I come back to this later. The configuration of parts may be the product of chance or exogenous factors. And thirdly, the configuration of parts is short-lived and non-stable, and it is not an instance of a multiple realized type. What does this all mean? Let's take one example. Consider Arthur Eddington, who observed the gravitational deflection in 1990. Of course, this story is very complex and the process took many years and so on, but here are some aspects of the process that can illustrate this mechanistic account. First, Eddington was interested in Einstein's theory and saw the testing of it as an opportunity to unite international scientific community that was shattered through World War I. Eddington working in Britain and Einstein in Germany, and there was no easy way to discuss Einstein's theory in Britain due to the hatred that was produced in World War I. And the process which led from Eddington's interest to the real testing involved many things, of course, but among other things, difficulties in communication to the wartime borders. It was very difficult to get information from Germany to Britain. And for example, Einstein's theory was known and endorsed by De Sitter, who lived in Netherlands. And De Sitter sent a letter to Britain about the theory, and Eddington received this letter due to his role in Royal Astronomical Society. So there was this chain from Einstein to De Sitter to Eddington, where this theory got these later developments in the theory of relativity, were transpassed to Eddington. And when we think this case in terms of these three conditions for ephemeral mechanisms, we can notice that first, there are generalizations, such as scientists react to the work of other scientists, and these are change-relating, direct, and invariant generalizations. We can also notice, more importantly, that the configuration of parts in the process was due to chance or contingency. For example, the communication during the war was difficult, as said, and there was a lucky coincidence that Eddington got information through Netherlands. It was very lucky that Eddington happened to be the one who received the letter from De Sitter. It was not sent to Eddington personally. So there was this chance and contingency in this event. And finally, we can see that the configuration was short-lived and non-stable. For example, the particular communication chain was short-lived and non-stable. It was only once there, and it never again served the same function. And moreover, it is not an instance of multiply realized type, as this type of chain is not similar to, for example, journals that transmit information regularly. It required this very particular people and communication. That there was no other way of replacing these people that would have made the outcome the same. So this is the ephemeral account. So we have these mechanisms that are short-lived, somewhat contingency, and tell how the historical outcome was a product of these parts and activities. I come back later to this theory again. Now I want to go briefly through the counterfactual account of explanation in historiography. In counterfactual account, the underlying or unifying idea in the notion of causal explanation is the idea that an explanation must answer what if things had been different questions, or exhibit information about patterns of dependency. This comes from Woodward's book, Making Things Happen from 2003, and this is very influential theory of causal explanation called interventionist theory. So we want to answer what if things had been different questions and exhibit information about patterns of dependency. To put it very simply, explanations answer questions of the form why X rather than Y by pointing out factors C and W such that had W rather than C been the case, Y rather than X would have been the case. So X is the actual outcome, Z is the actual historical event, W is an alternative historical event to Z, and Y is an alternative outcome for X. And when we explain X, we want to know why X rather than Y happened, and we cite information about Z and W. These explanations provide information about counterfactual dependencies between the explanans and the explanandum, and they are contrastive in nature. When we ask why X, we are always asking why X rather than Y. This makes this contrastive explanation. An explanation must enable us to see what sort of difference it would have been made for the explanandum if the factors cited in the explanans had been different in various possible ways. So when we give this very simple explanation, we can see how X would have changed to Y if W was the case. The basic idea is quite simple and intuitive. Let's take one example. We can ask why was the deflection observed in 1919 rather than some other times? This was Eddington making this observation. And if we put one very crude explanation in terms of counterfactual theory, we can say that because theory of relativity was formulated a few years before, and because Eddington had the incentive to reunite the international scientific community. And here comes the crucial part. Had the theory been formulated later, or had there not been such incentive, the observation would not have been made in 1990. Here we can see that the observation counterfactually depends on the formulation of theory and Eddington's incentive. If the formulation of theory is absent or the incentive, then the outcome, the observation would not have happened. There is dependency. Now that we understand very crudely the basic ideas of mechanistic account and counterfactual account, let's compare these two accounts in terms of how well they enable us to map the conceptual space surrounding causal explanations in history. In other words, we want to know which of these theories is at least with respect to those three issues that we discuss, which of this theory is more powerful. Let's go first to the explanatory depth. And we need to ask how suitable the accounts are for the clarification of the conceptual space. And this conceptual space involves issues such as explanatory depth. And now we already can see that in the ephemeral mechanisms view, it is somewhat difficult to understand when one explanation is deeper than another one. It seems that a natural interpretation of the notion of explanatory depth in the mechanistic view would be that a more detailed description of a mechanism provides a deeper explanation. So the intuitive idea that if we have described a mechanism and then we describe it in more detail, then we have gained some depth to our explanation. Now the problem is that this will not do unless we assume that the new description, this more detailed description, is about explanatory relevant details. What details we add, they have to be explanatory relevant. And the problem is that in order to identify explanatory relevant details concerning a mechanism, we need to have a notion of explanatory relevant factor that is independent of the notion of a factor that is a constituent in a mechanism. If this independence is allowed, the mechanistic account does not provide a satisfactory analysis of explanation, and as it does not define the most central notion, in other words, explanatory relevant. So the problem is that the mechanistic philosophy would like to say that what is causally and explanatory relevant is coded into a description of a mechanism. Now, if they want to say that we can have more detailed descriptions of the mechanisms, then they have to give some way of discussing when details are relevant. It cannot be just that whatever is in the description of the mechanism, because we can have more or less detailed descriptions of the same mechanism. And of course, this would be an inconsistency, because one description would say that these and these and these are causally relevant. Another would say that these and these and these are causally relevant. If causal relevance was read only from the description of the mechanism. And if we put an additional notion of explanatory relevant factor in order to make sense of these more detailed descriptions, then we need to, or we have this problem that we no longer define explanatory relevant in terms of mechanisms, but we define mechanisms in terms of explanatory relevant factors. And this is bad news for the mechanistic account if it tries to define the core notion. On the other hand, in the counterfactual account, we can understand explanatory depth in historiography in terms of answering a greater range of what if things had been different questions. We saw that an explanation answers what if things had been different questions. And we can say that one explanation is better when it answers more such questions or more important questions. And this idea comes from Hitchcock and Woodward, and I have defended it before. And here is a simple example. If E says that had Einstein not formulated the theory, or had he provided a different formulation, the observation of gravitational deflection would not have been made. So we have here two factors on which this observation counterfactually depends on. And if E star says that had Einstein not formulated the theory, the observation of the gravitational deflection would not have been made, we have cited only one factor. And in this very simple case, we can say that E is a deeper explanation than E star, since it answers a what if question about Einstein, providing a different formulation. So we answer more what if questions with this E than E star, so E is deeper. As said, I have elsewhere analyzed different ways in which one historiographical explanation can be deeper according to the counterfactual theory. But the point here is that the counterfactual theory has a very clear way of making sense of this notion of explanatory depth, and the mechanistic account does not. It's unclear how mechanistic account can say that one explanation is better than another one, and at the same time hold that a description of mechanism is something from which we can distill causal factors. Now let's move to contingency. First, we can notice that Glennon, when he discusses ephemeral mechanisms, defines contingency in terms of how ephemeral the mechanism producing the outcome was. And it is simple that the degree to which a historical outcome is contingent is a consequence of the degree to which the mechanism that produced it was ephemeral. So the more ephemeral the mechanism, the more contingent the outcome. Now the problem one could say is that first, an outcome is not contingent, even if it was produced by an ephemeral mechanism, if that same outcome would have been produced by a different mechanism in the absence of the actual producing mechanism. So we might have these backup mechanisms that would provide the same outcome, and in that case, it seems like the wrong judgment to say that the outcome was contingent. Secondly, it is usually thought, as we saw in the beginning, that it is usually thought that there are degrees of contingency within the workings of a mechanism, not merely in the formation of the mechanism. There is this talk about turning points and so on, and it is thought that these are within the narratives or mechanisms as Glennon analysis would characterize them, but they are within the workings of the mechanism. And it seems that this definition of contingency cannot capture this within mechanism contingency. But now, to be fair, it should be pointed out that Glennon denies this widespread idea. Glennon explicitly goes against this tradition of causal narrative, saying that I would argue that to the extent that a narrative fails to show the necessity of the outcome, it fails to explain. For in such case, we really have no explanation of what about the particular circumstances necessitated the outcome. Now, as we saw, this goes against the conceptual space where the contingency within a narrative was judged as essential to historiography. And given the two-directional methodology that we discussed in the beginning, we could say that this is a problem for Glennon and ephemeral mechanisms, because it seems that when we discuss this conceptual space surrounding historiographical explanations, there is this discussion about narratives, and this discussion about narratives seems to show that contingency within narrative is very important to historiography, and it is something that we should be able to understand when we discuss philosophy of historiography. And it seems that Glennon's account fails in this task of making this very central notion understandable. Now, if we turn to the counterfactual theory, I have argued that the way to approach questions of contingency is to build counterfactual scenarios that would have led to a different outcome, and then evaluate the plausibility of this scenario. So if we want to understand whether an outcome was contingent, we need to build a scenario where that outcome was different, and then we need to analyze how plausible it was that this scenario took place. In other words, we need to know what should have happened in the past in order for there to be some alternative to the actual outcome, and then evaluate how plausible or far-fetched that occurrence was. And if a plausible change would have led to a different outcome, the outcome was contingent. If a plausible change in the history leads to different outcome, then the outcome is contingent. This is what I have argued in 2018. And this is a natural consequence of the difference making or counterfactual account of causal explanation. And we should notice that the difference making definition of contingency can incorporate both contingency per se and contingent upon, which we discussed in the beginning. The notion of contingent upon is obvious in this theory. We can say that X is contingent upon Z when X depends on Z. As Daniel Swine points out, the notion of contingency upon is fairly uncontroversial. The popularity of counterfactual theories of causal explanation attests to this fact. So contingent upon part of contingency that we observed in causal narratives is something that follows directly as it can from the counterfactual theory. So counterfactual theory can very, very easily make sense of this notion of contingency upon. On the other hand, contingency per se, we can see it is a limiting case of the definition above. If X is contingent per se, if the different outcome could have followed, X is contingent per se if the different outcome could have followed from the actual conditions. For example, the outcome O of a coin toss T is a contingent per se because its alternative O star could have happened while the actual T happened, or very close, of course, but in a world very close to what is actual world, the outcome of the coin toss would have been different. So if we talk about these purely stochastic processes, then we can easily explain this contingency per se as a limiting case case of this more wide definition. Per se is like as contingent as it gets. If it's like super plausible that the historical scenario that led to different outcome happened, then the outcome is contingent per se. For example, it is super close to the actual world. It's just a very minimal changes in the initial conditions of the coin would have lead to a different outcome. So it's very close, very plausible, and that's why it's a limiting case. We can already notice that there is much more to the notion of contingency than the categories contingency upon and contingency per se can capture. These are something that we saw, this per se and contingent upon, but actually they are not all there is to contingency. For example, we can very easily see that Eddington's observation in 1919 was contingent in a much stronger sense than just being dependent on something. But it is a contingent in much weaker sense than just being chancy or unpredictable. The observation could have been different given plausible changes in the history, such as the disruption of communication chains. So that Eddington made the observation, it's not only dependent on the past in the sense that it can be explained, and it is not something that's happened out of the blue that could have predicted, but it could have been different had there been very plausible changes in the past, like that the De Sitter letter did not find its way to Eddington. And what is important here is that actually here, when we look at the counterfactual theory, the explication of a core notion gives additional insights. So we wanted to clarify these notions of contingency upon and contingency per se, but we happened to achieve much more deep insight into contingency in historiography. And in this way, the clarification of core notions can be very useful for mapping the conceptual space in itself. Now, finally, we can discuss generalizations and how these two accounts deal with them. And this is the easy part, because both ephemeral mechanisms account and the counterfactual account build in generalizations into explanations. The ephemeral mechanism was defined in terms of interactions between parts can be characterized by direct, invariant, and change-relating generalizations. So ephemeral mechanisms, they build in the notion that historiography requires generalizations, even though these generalizations may not have large scope and so on, or wide scope or so. And we can say that counterfactual account requires generalizations that describe recurrent patterns of causal structure with a limited scope. And while the explanatory work is done by patterns of counterfactual dependencies, generalizations provide the access to these patterns. So the difference between these two accounts when it comes to generalizations is that ephemeral mechanisms build in the generalizations in the definition of causal explanation in historiography, and counterfactual account needs to rely on them in order to make the epistemology of explanations possible. And what is more, when it comes to the generalizations or ability to construct mechanisms or track counterfactual scenarios may set new questions and guide the search for evidence. So both these accounts can make sense of how narratives and explanations and generalizations can be mutually beneficial. It's not just that we take generalizations from out of somewhere and apply them to historiography, but we can also understand how construction of explanations can contribute to our analysis of different types of generalizations. Because when these accounts of explanations make possible generalizations explicit, this first limits the types of considerations that are required in the assessment of the explanatory claim. So we can only focus on those considerations that can be used for or against the generalization. And in the best cases, just how new evidence could be relevant by telling what evidence should be relevant for the justification of generalization. I won't go into this in detail. Adrian Curry has some very good works on this. But we can notice that given these two accounts, both can make sense of generalizations in historiography, and both can explain how explanations can help us to analyze generalizations. And finally, I want to point out that, of course, we have to also discuss the core notions themselves. We have not done it too much today, and we have not critically assessed them, because our interest has been in how well the core notions can map the conceptual space and how well they can make sense of that conceptual space. But of course, my argument is not that we should forget analyzing the conceptual cores themselves. And this is something that, of course, philosophers mainly do, is the analysis of how coherent and plausible the conceptual cores themselves are. And of course, I will just give two examples of what could be considered as problems for these theories that or accounts that I discussed. First, the ephemeral mechanism account requires counterfactual supporting generalization, granted. The problem is in this core notion is that the exact meaning of this notion is left unclear. As we know, barometer readings and storms are connected by change relating and counterfactual supporting generalization. Had the barometer reading dropped, a storm would have appeared. And of course, we know that this is only a correlation. And the mechanistic account should somehow explain how this generalization can be understood in their theory. This is just one example that one would put as a criticism for the account, that it does not define everything it should define. And of course, one of the main criticisms for the counterfactual account would be that we should be told how counterfactuals can be tracked and know. Counterfactuals are by definition about events that did not happen. How can we know anything about those events? We cannot have any evidence about them. We only have evidence about the actual works. So one could say that, all right, counterfactual theory, which might have become clear, is my favorite theory. But one could argue that the cost of these abilities to ability to map the conceptual space in counterfactual theory comes at the cost of obscure epistemology. So even if we win something in our ability to map the conceptual space, we are hitting an epistemological wall. And here is my conclusion for the talk. It is simply that we have seen that philosophy of historiography can be seen as a clarification of conceptual issues in the field. We can see that philosophy of historiography can be seen as a way of discussing conceptual space, core notions, and the connection between the two. It can be seen as a way, as an analysis of the core notions that can explain the conceptual space, or it can do conceptual analysis of the space in order to tell what we should do when we analyze the core notions. So it doesn't matter where you start from, you can do both. But the important issue is that the surrounding space and the core need to be connected. And as said, mapping the conceptual space sets constraints on the core notions. What we know or philosophical insights about historiographical explanation must force us to do certain kinds of definitions when we discuss the core notions. We cannot, for example, Hempel's model where we have initial conditions and universal laws it is not even within the discussion, because it cannot make sense of any of the important issues that that we know about historiography, about narratives, about contingency, about death, and so on. And finally, only thing that we want from these core notions is that they help us to understand the conceptual space and provide novel insights on it. And as we have seen, analysis of core notions can help us to understand the conceptual space and provide novel insights on it. For example, a counterfactual account of explanation can make contingency understandable, and it can provide additional insight on it. When we saw this when we discussed how it goes further than the definitions of contingency per se and contingent upon. Here is all for today from me. I think we shall discuss next. Thank you all for listening. I hope it makes some sense to you. And of course, here is some literature that I have cited. I can send everything to you if you want. So that's it.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Veli, for the talk. Now it's time for discussion. Is there anybody who would immediately like to say something? Well, maybe you can all think a bit. I could just ask off the top of my head a very basic question. Starting from the end, you have defined sort of both mechanistic and counterfactual accounts are dependent on certain kind of forms of generalizations, limited scope, maybe exception written, but there's a certain form of generalizations that need to be part of it. So would it be totally out of the blue to then just say maybe what causality is defined by these sort of exception written generalizations, because both of the core categories that we try to understand need this sort of thing. So maybe then what causality is something like causal powers, whatever that means. Then it brings you a different problem, but that would seem like then that would give us the sort of an understanding of what causality is. If both of the core notions which can explain historiography best bank on the same sort of understanding of causality, then this might be what causality is. Does it make sense what I asked? Do you understand what I mean?
Yeah, it makes sense.
There's this sort of causal powers account in the philosophy of science and metaphysics as well, you know, often together with structural realism and natural kinds, this sort of stuff. So you can link it to that as well. There's a very different discussions, but
probably. But I would say that we still need some like conceptual machine that tells us how those generalizations are in fact turned into explanations, and not just like something that we say that there are this kind of regularities and so on. And for example, in mechanistic account, it would be that it reveals a mechanism, and we are interested in mechanisms. It's just a fact that we take from, at least in science, is that we are interested in mechanisms, and descriptions of the mechanisms are like this platform where these generalizations provide their explanatory function. And the counterfactual theory would say that the platform is these patterns of dependency, that we want patterns of dependencies, and that's why the generalization, that because they provide these patterns of dependencies, that's why they do this explanation. One could say that because explanation is something that we do, and it is something that is like, in one way or another, it's a human-centered notion. At least on some level. So it doesn't, even if let's say that even if we knew this issue is independent of generalizations, even if we knew the causal relations in the world, if we have God-given list, one could still say that we need to have some kind of conceptual format where we take pieces from this causal knowledge and turn them into something else which gives us understanding.
Thank you very much, Veli. Is there any questions now? Concerns? Matti, please.
Yeah, thank you, Veli. Very interesting and clear, I think. I have a few questions, and I begin with a very kind of general, I guess you could call it a philosophical question. So you took up the notion, the idea of core notion. Is that something that you are using more, or how would you define a core notion? I presume that causality is one of them. Is it something to be really substantially or seriously be taken, that there would be a set of core problems or notions?
I mean, core notion simply is a notion which we presume that can be used in making sense of other issues in the conceptual space. The core is kind of that, for example, when we could say that one core notion is causal explanation, and it is core notion in the sense that if we are able to define that notion, then we are able to define another further notions.
So it's like a nested one.
And of course one could ask whether there is some other, like, more deeper core notions that could be used to define causal explanation. One could say that causal explanations is a notion that can be further, like that it is a phenomena that some even deeper core notion should define. But I don't go to this like very deep question. It is like, it is basically, it's a pragmatical term that when we do philosophy of X, the X is the core notion, and what we want to do is to explain issues that are related to X. So it is merely the starting point. What we want to understand, it is the core.
Yeah. Just a brief follow-up on that. So you wouldn't be tempted to go into a direction of defining foundational problems of the philosophy of historiography. That was a bit of the idea of the workshop. That, I mean, not as in so deep sense, but anyway, to identify.
Yeah. Well, maybe I would, maybe I wouldn't, but that's not like the point that I wish to keep this independent of that. I don't think that. But as said, I could imagine that one could say that there are some core problems, and that they are the hardcore, and they might be something that does not even involve causal explanation. But given that we define those issues, one could say that those issues have to be defined in a way that makes sense of the causal explanations. For example, one could say, and this is just from the top of my head, that one core issue, and this probably would be a core issue if there were any, is that whether there is mind-independent past that historians provide knowledge of. This probably would be, this question of historical realism would probably be one of the core issues. And then one could say that whatever answer we give this, we need to be able to make sense of causal explanations with our answers. And in that sense, we could perhaps proceed into that direction, but that's not perhaps perhaps I wish to keep the point a bit more modest.
Okay.
There's if you have another question, maybe later, Joni-Matti, there's Bowen who has another
later
question first. Yes, please, Bowen, you're next.
Yeah, thank you so much for this wonderful lecture, and your discussions about the problems that around the current investigations about explanations. This is part I totally agree, and your discussions on the ephemeral mechanisms and the counterfactual account is precise and clear. But I have a similar question as Veli-Matti do, is about the core notion of the core notion, which is perhaps the essence of your study. But if we cannot pin down the core notion first, how would we define the conceptual space that happens around it? And if we cannot pin down the core notion in the first place, how we are able to discuss all sorts of relations that you just discussed, that is being accounted by a narrative? And I guess you do have something to say about that, because you briefly mentioned it in the last part of your in the very end of your lecture. So could you please elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, that is a great question, because because now that you said it, it doesn't make sense to say that we go like with this conceptual space, if we go into this conceptual space without understanding what is like the center of the gravity of that space. No, I think that the answer, at least in the case of causal explanation, is that these notions come from this discussion about these causal narratives, and in that discussion, it is more or less explicitly assumed that these narratives confer causal information. It is kind of the starting point of this philosophical analysis that the core notions want to make sense of. So it is kind of inherent in there. They use this language of explanations and causality, even if they don't. They of course their work is not. They don't care about giving this like philosophically precise analysis as good word, but they still use this language which indicates that it is something that we want to connect. But of course, one could say that this does not answer anything, because one could say that how can we, for example, find new issues that we need to clarify, and more importantly, if we say that the core notions live or die with their ability to clarify certain issues, and if we disagree which issues are important and which issues should be related, of course, this methodology doesn't get anywhere. So, but I don't have any answer to that. I have to be honest that then I might be lost if this criticism was given to me.
Yes, I would have a short follow-up on this. Anybody else can talk after, unless there's something. Maybe I should talk. I have a follow-up on this. This is a very interesting point. I also had the same question in my head, because your choice of the conceptual neighborhood, conceptual space, these three further notions that the core notions have to elucidate or help to elucidate or explicate is explorative depth, contingency, and generalization. But there are other, on the face of it, anti-causal positions in the philosophy of historiography. It's not just power off, it's also all this kind of understanding of action. Actions are not causes. There's all reasons are not causes, philosophy of action. There's all that sort of stuff. Now, you and me might agree that we can rephrase that causally, we might not, but this is something, so your three concepts already are theory laden in the sense that you already have sort of them, because you're interested in causality, perhaps therefore you have chosen those. I'm not saying it's wrong, but what would you say if I answered, well, I'm a dyed-in-the-wool anti-causalist, and that's all not important? What is important is understanding of action, and that is reasons. This is different from causal explanation.
Yeah, but then I would say that I really don't I don't care that much, because there certainly is this people who want to understand like how these narratives describe these turning points and use this causal language. I would just say that I don't care that maybe you are in the other corner of historiography, but actually more serious criticism, which if we connect this to the previous one, is that if somebody says that accounts of causal explanation have to make sense of actions and action talk and reason talks, and the other one says that no, it doesn't, because it's another issue, then what should we do? Should we like abandon one notion like this? For example, let's assume, I haven't thought this so much, but let's assume that the mechanistic account cannot say anything about how reasons and rationality works in history. Should we use this as an evidence against this account? Because there might be very deep disagreements whether causal explanation, theories of causal explanation, need to make sense of actions. And here I think is theory-laden part is that if either you assume that causality can explain or is related to actions, or it is not, and depending on your answer, you put it in the conceptual space or you don't put it. And there is this kind of incommensurable, I cannot pronounce it, but they are incompatible, these conceptual spaces. And what should we do in this case? Which to map? I think this is genuine criticism, but I don't think the fact is that if somebody is only causalist, I think there is this meta issue that there would be too many issues that cannot be make sense, then one should eliminate all the causal talks in philosophy of historiography and historiography in itself. And I honestly think that is an impossible project.
Well, that comes down a bit to what Jouni-Matti said before. Maybe then causality is you either buy into or not. So it's kind of a primitivist category.
But I want to make one clarification. I am not saying that the causality itself has to be the fundamental notion. It could be that causality can be analyzed away. That's not, but this, what is usually considered as causal explanations, we need to somehow handle them in philosophy of historiography. Maybe we can abandon the concept of causality, but we cannot abandon these issues. And there is a difference. I am not defending, at least not explicitly, the idea that causality must be kind of fundamental notion in philosophy of historiography. One could give, for example, some notion of explanation and use that to define causal explanations. I say that causality is just something that our mind puts in the world after explanations are given.
Okay, great. Now, any further questions, concerns, remarks? Is there someone?
I have a question.
Oh, yes, please.
Can contingency per se provide us with a way of tracking counterfactuals, or vice versa? Don't we already sort of have a sense of the counterfactuals that are possible in mind that we've implicitly tracked in order to posit the idea of per se conditions? So when you flip a coin, you've already thought that there's two discrete outcomes, heads or tails. So you have you're tracking these counterfactuals that way.
Well, maybe one good thing that there are, if an event is contingent per se, it is kind of a point where we could start a counterfactual scenario. But I actually think that the problem of trackability is that if we say that had some event happened, this or that would have happened, how can we justify this? And now I actually think that if there are a lot of events that are contingent per se, it makes this even more difficult, because if I say that had I flipped, let's assume that I didn't flip the coin at all, but then I say that had I flipped the coin, it would have ended up in tails. And if this is contingent per se, it seems that I have no justification for this, because it's like 50-50. I cannot track this counterfactual scenario, what would have happened had I tossed the coin, because it can take two directions. And what we would like these counterfactual theories, scenarios to do is to track from the beginning to the outcome. If X is what happened and Z is what we suppose it is cause, and then we ask why X rather than Y happened, and we answer that W happened, then we would like to have this neat counterfactual scenario that leads directly to Y. And the problem with trackability is that how can we construct this kind of step-by-step scenario? And if there are contingencies per se, then this scenario would be even more difficult to set. But of course, we could say that contingency per se makes it possible in the first place to assume that this W could have been the case. So my answer would be that contingency per se helps us to make sense of how counterfactual scenarios can be like started, but they cannot be helpful in following those scenarios.
That answered. Yeah, any further questions? I have a problem understanding contingency per se as a concept, but this is a different issue, I suppose. Is there anybody who wants to answer, ask, or make a comment? Yeah, Jouni-Matti?
Yeah, okay. This is about the counterfactual strategy itself. I think it's a very nice and intuitive way to go. It would be very nice to apply it to, the historiography, actual cases, and go through the books. Well, you have done a little bit of that, but really go into the depth of thinking the scenarios. So what is contingent, what is maybe necessary, and so on. What I kind of think that, this is a question to you, isn't it, when we are considering counterfactual scenarios, isn't it always based on our intuition, what we think can happen and what can't. And maybe underlying our intuition, there's a generalization which we haven't explicated. So there's a lot of depth. I know that in the end you say that we need to, you didn't really analyze the notion of causality, but this is how I feel. If you go into the examples, you had Eddington. Okay, what did he do? He gave some proof for Einstein's theories of relativity and so on and so forth. And okay, we have a counterfactual scenario, and then if he hadn't observed what he did, then he wouldn't be able to give this proof. Okay, sounds sensible. If he, let's suppose he wear a hat the day, like a blue hat, and if he had a red hat, and if he had a red hat, he wouldn't have observed. Now it doesn't sound very sensible to us again. So there's some, but there's a lot of that we should need to write about. If you go into, let's say, general historiography, it gets even much more difficult. I mean, you have cases of this, well, with, why did Hitler rose to power? Okay, if no one gave him food and nutrition when he was a child, he wouldn't have, because he would have died. Okay, but then if you get, there's so many possible scenarios and so many possible causes. Had he given this famous speech in Munich in Bierkeller, then would he have come to power later on, or so on and so forth? So there's so much stuff that it's just, at the end of the day, it seems that it's our intuition says one way or the other. Owen, how would you?
First of all, I completely agree that there simply is too much in history, and that is actually what. But I would just say that that's why historiography is so difficult, and that's why we have so little like really good works in historiography after all. Because historiography is not something that can be easily done. Actually, it's because it's so much more than even reasoning from actual evidence. But that's another discussion. What I would say that I actually hate this idea or this discussion when we discuss counterfactuals, and in philosophy of historiography, a lot of time when we discuss counterfactuals, it's framed with this terminology of thought experiments, and I don't like it. There are, we can do it intuitively, but I think there are much more controlled ways of doing it. And for example, if we go to this Eddington case, we can, for example, say that it actually speaks against or very naive conception of science, in that it doesn't seem to be true, for example, that Eddington followed merely the evidence in order to judge what the photos were saying to him, but there was influence from personal commitment to this project, and it influenced how he judged the data analysis. And now when we track this counterfactual, we that what would have happened, for example, had Eddington had different personal background. If we take this very naive idea of science, one could say that, okay, he would have made the same conclusion, because scientists only follow evidence. This would be a generalization, very naive, very like intuitive generalization. But what we know about this case from how it actually went, we can say that probably this is not the case, that because there was this personal influence in so many other parts of this process, that we can actually say that had he had different personal background, it could have been possible that he made different conclusion. And I don't think we are playing with the intuitions in some sense here, but we are discussing actually two different generalizations for or against which we can have at least some kind of evidence. That would be my answer. So, but I admit that in many cases, admittedly, there has to be some kind of fundamental intuitions or even fundamental beliefs about how the world works, how much one individual works in history or matters in history and so on. And I don't think there is any answer. I do not believe that there is like there is any method that could give us like scenarios that we all agree on, and so on. But it can be much more controlled than merely citing intuitions.
Yes, thank you, Veli. There's Bowen had another question. Please go.
Okay. Okay. So if I understand you correctly, I found there's another like implicit thread like in your reasoning that's on the narrative, because if I understand correctly, narrative can like reflect different depth of explanation, and it can express contingency in a sense that it can tell us what things could have happened differently. And you said that narrative can support generalization. So does narrative just passively reflect the kind of process in our mind in sake of causality, or it has some sort of autonomy? Because to me, narrative is a thing that organizes this sort of conceptual space, and it's kind of a media that we use or understand to make sense of this sort of conceptual space. So you also said that we should focus more on the fruit rather than the seeds. And if that's the case, the most important intellectual endeavor perhaps should be put on narratives, but not on the like core notions or conceptual space. I don't know if you agree with that.
I agree, and I actually think that these works that discuss narrative possibility, narratives and generalizations, narratives and explanatory depth, I actually think, if I give my honest opinion, they are much more illuminating about historiography and historical sciences than the analysis of core notions. And one could argue that this is all we need to do. Let's forget about this age-old philosophical definition given for this supposedly fundamental. They should just define whatever happens there, and let's not assume that we can analyze it any further. But my argument would be that as I try to give some examples where the analysis of core notions provide additional insight into the conceptual space and enables to clarify when there are some ambiguities. For example, we might have different intuitions about contingency, and then we would really want to have a definition of contingency that can separate those intuitions, and that is based on something which, in my opinion, is a theory of explanation. And of course, one more argument would be that the analysis of core notions, even if it's not all that entertaining and nice, and it is still something that has philosophical value in itself, because it is something that philosophers have done. It has at least some kind of cultural value, that we have this tradition that we want to understand causality, and that's why we need to continue this tradition, even if there are more interesting things to do. That would be my answer.
Okay, I have a short follow-up again. Sorry, shouldn't interject myself so much. But this reminds me of something, and I'm not particularly an expert in it. I just tried to read into that recently. If the core notion of causality is not so important in the grand scheme of things, perhaps, wouldn't then be the right way to go what is usually referred to as inference to the best explanation? Because inference to the best explanation is defined sometimes as a way of getting rid of these difficult questions of what causality is, so that they do, as what you said, to determine what the connection is between the exponents and the exponent. Is it a mechanism? Is it counterfactual? Is it laws? Is it a statistical generalization? Is it deductive? Is it inductive? Then we just, what explains best the evidence? But then, of course, you have to give a criterion what is best explanation. And then you have maybe the criteria you gave, maybe explanatory depth is one of them, or some others. But then you wouldn't have to talk about what causation is. But I admit myself, I don't know this literature very well, but some people claim that inference to the best explanation is a way to get rid of these age-old discussions that are not productive on one level. Do you know that in any case?
Yeah, I know this discussion, and I completely disagree, and this is, I think, a discussion for some other day. But briefly, I would say that the problem with this inference to explanation as solving the issue is not that. What I'm against, and this is very important, I don't think that the theory of explanation or an account of explanation in historiography is needed in order for historians to make explanations or justify them. That's not the point. That's not the point. The point is, rather than it is kind of bedrock on which we can rely on when we have ambiguities in some parts of our reason. For example, when we want to know whether this or that explanation is deeper, that's when we would like to have some account which can define this notion. And I think there is this, and this is of course this is going to YouTube, but I think there is this the idea that inference to explanation is something that solves the philosophical problems of explanation. It is, I think it takes the wrong starting point, that there is no need for us to be, the point is not for us to be judges of when historians have found explanations and when not. For example, one could accuse Hempel of doing something like this when he said that but historians only give explanatory sketches. That he's like a judge who says that you have given an explanation and you are not, because you do. And I don't think this is the role we should take. The accounts of explanation, they have to be faithful for what historians, the explanations they give. And that is, but that is another criteria, which of course it's another discussion. This is one methodology that I discussed today. And of course, one could be that, for example, to be honest, you cannot find explanations that are explicitly counterfactual in many places without doing at least some very heavy reconstructions. And one could argue that this actually is against the theory. And I agree, because I don't think that the theory should judge what is an explanation in historiography, but what is considered as an historical explanation should serve as a judge for whether that theory is good. And here is, but this goes a bit off topic, but this is why I think these arguments that inference to explanation solves this philosophical problem is not going to get us anywhere. It has several methodological shortcomings.
So you just outed yourself as a naturalist, perhaps not. It's a different discussion, but is there any, maybe it's the good ending word, I wouldn't know. Is there anybody else who has a more question, comments, concerns? I mean, as I just said, we can continue in the informal a bit more. If there's not, then I was
going to ask about go back to the notion of contingency itself. Just I don't know, want to hear your thoughts about what it is actually. Is there the idea of something being absolutely contingent? Does it make sense? You know, absolutely contingent, you know, or translates into something like that, you know, nothing necessarily had to happen. And that's of course a very strong metaphysical thing to say. Or is it always that when we are talking about contingency, we are talking about contingency in relation to what? So something like the A is contingent with respect to B. So B could have happened without A. How? Yeah.
I think there is this that at least in historiography, the notion of absolute contingency makes no sense. It perhaps makes sense when we discuss the decay of radioactive particles or something like that. That then it is kind of there is nothing in some sense on which the time of the decay depends on. It can happen like now or tomorrow. Of course, there are statistical laws that, but one could say that is actually contingent in some absolute sense. If we believe that the fundamental physics is stochastic, but but I don't think there is anything like this in historiography. I think contingency is always kind of how well the outcome could have been different. And of course, this relates on judgments about plausibility and so on. But it is always, I think that an historical event is always contingent in the sense that that it happened requires that we change something in the history. And the question is whether that change could happen. How we believe that it is a difficult question.
I believe that a historian's core belief is that history is contingent. You know, the next election of the government of Finland, what it will be is somehow contingent. It could be this or could be that combination. And yeah, some kind of rejection of determinism in some deeper sense would be the contingency. Do you think what you say is compatible with that? If I'm right with that?
In this case, I would try to explain away the historian's intuition about that history is contingent and try to write their ideas in terminology of how they actually believe that the past, that it could have easily been different. That if we say that it is contingent that Eddington made the observation in some sense, I would say that actually what you are, when you are looking at the process, you are thinking that those things could have been different. And that gives you the feeling of some kind of absolute or fundamental contingency, but it's not. It's only a kind of
relative
outcome of these other activities that you do. In this case, I would try to explain away because I think it would be ontologically too much to allow this kind of. And there is even this problem that history is contingent because there are so many different levels of history. That to say that Hitler's rise to power was contingent and that the defeat of Wehrmacht was contingent, they are very different kind of claims. And if we just take some ontological position that history is contingent and therefore all these are contingent, there is some uneasiness. At least I feel for this. This is somehow this is too much ontology for me.
Yes, thank great. And there's also, I always like this idea. I think it's from Ben Menachem that things are not contingent or not; they're more or less contingent. And
yeah, definitely.
And she defined it upon what did she say? Sensitivity to initial conditions. Things that are more sensitive to specific initial conditions are more contingent, and there are some further requirements later also by Derek Turner and I think Inkpen is the other guy's name, who have tried to refine that concept. But that gives us a grasp of beyond this very strange, very strong metaphysical claim something history is contingent.
Yeah, my definition of contingency that I discussed even in this talk is actually kind of later version of Ben Menachem's definition because he defines it in terms of similarity. And I just kind of replaced the similarity with plausibility. And I have this very simple, if we say that something is contingent, if it would have been absent in similar initial conditions. For example, a good chess player opening with e4 or e3 are quite similar. But there is no contingency here because it's not plausible that they open with e3. If you just look at the board, they are very similar conditions, but there is no plausibility that the good player opened with e3, and say that the outcome was contingent that the player won the game was due to the fact that he played e4 instead of e3. It is not contingent because there is this very similar looking initial condition which would have led to defeat, but this is perhaps for another discussion. But yeah, it is. I completely agree with this basic strategy to tie contingency to initial conditions and give degrees to it. But I disagree with the similarity-based metrics.
Okay, great. So I ask a final time. Is there any further questions, concerns, comments? Do you want to say something more still, Veli? Or maybe not?
No, yeah.
Okay, then now I have my final speech. Thank you all very much for joining us today. And a special thank you to Veli for his talk. And we'll see you soon again. And we'll now stay on as a bit to chat for anybody who's interested in talking to us. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.